Hey there, how there, ho there, Chef Cutter Diamond welcoming you to yet another Cutter Top 10 NHL style video. And today we're going to be looking at the top 10 NHL most lopsided trades in history. There have been some many great trades in the NHL, but there are some that are massive lopsided. And, how about? I know the Leafs have been involved in several, and you may be thinking, well, how many are the Leafs involved in? Well, only two. I don't want to make it a Leaf Central list. Oh yeah, forgot to show the Rangers stuff, which will be on the list. There we go. Number 10 is Yammer Yager from Pittsburgh to Washington 2001. Pittsburgh had money problems. Mario Lemieux just came back from retirement. Pittsburgh was getting close to being bankrupt and all that. Yammer Yager wanted Coyd and all that, so Pittsburgh had troubles. So Pittsburgh, knowing that Yager wasn't really working well with some coaches, decided to trade Yager to Washington for Chris Beach, Michael Simic, and Russ Lupashuk. None of them worked out, although Chris Beach kind of worked out in a sense, but the other two did not. Yager was a dominant force. Pittsburgh would rude to get rid of him to Washington, although Washington would get rid of Yager to the Rangers in 2004. Which actually helped the Rangers out because they started to get a little better. But yeah, Yager got himself out of Pittsburgh. He played for many NHL teams after that. Number 9 is the Brett Hall trade from Calgary to St. Louis 1988. It was very one-sided. I mean, Brett Hall, an icon, being traded away and being sent for scraps or anything else. Brett Hall had been dealt to he played for Dallas and Detroit and Phoenix, but signed as free agent contracts. But anyway, Brett Hall was an iconic player, and Calgary didn't like his selfishness and his laziness, so they traded him and Steve Bozek to the Blues for Rob Ramage. In this household, it's basically he who shall not be named because of what he did to Keith Magnuson in a car crash 2003 and Rick Walmsley. At first, it wasn't that bad of a deal. I mean, Hall and Bozak worked for St. Louis. Ramage and Walmsley did win titles. Did win the 1989 Stanley Cup Final with Calgary, so they got a ring and all that. Ramage would soon become captain of the Leafs and pissing me off in a more different light, although I was 6 years old. And Rick Walmsley was there too. So yes, Rick Walmsley. There. But Walmsley ended up being a Leaf too in that 92 Gilmore deal. But anyhow, it was lopsided once Brett Hall started scoring goals and having St. Louis out, and Calgary just got fleeced. Number 8 is the Cam Neely trade from Vancouver to Boston 1986. I know you'd be thinking, what? Cam Neely was not always a Boston Bruin? Actually, you're right. Cam Neely was a Vancouver Canuck. He got drafted from British Columbia by the Canucks, and he played 3 seasons. He was okay and all that. And then Vancouver didn't think Neely would amount to much, and they found this 50-goal scorer by the name of Barry Pedersen. They figured they might as well trade Neely for Pedersen. Pedersen would be a flop. I have his card with the Hartford Whalers in 91, but Cam Neely became a Bruins legend. And, especially 50 goals in 44 games 1 year. He was iconic and all that. Who's the dead man who hit me in the head with a salt shaker? But yeah, Cam Neely traded from Vancouver to Boston. It's not right. It just isn't right. Number 7 is Scotty Niedermayer to the Devils 91. Now, Scott Niedermayer wasn't traded to the Devils in 91. It was his draft pick. Let me explain. 1989, the Leafs needed what they called a power play quarterback. So they found this defenseman by the name of Tom Kurvers, who played for the Americans in the 84 Olympics. To get Kurvers, they had to get rid of a first-round draft pick. Easy enough. So they sent their first-round pick in 1991, thinking, okay, we'll be fine. Unfortunately, Kurvers would end up being in Vancouver and the Islanders that season too. Worst of all for the Leafs in 91 is they sucked. It was the second worst NHL team. They would have drafted third in the pick because San Jose was given the number 2 pick as his bench team in Quebec took Lindros. So it was Lindros, Pat Falloon, who was a flop, the Sharks. And then the third overall pick went to the Devils, and Scotty Niedermayer was drafted from Kamloops, and he became the star defenseman for the Devils and the Ducks. And the Leafs were eating massive crow and all that, getting rid of a first round pick for Tom fucking Curvers. It made no sense at all. Number 6 is the Patrick Roy deal. I know Patrick Roy is my idol. He should be top 3. No, don't play that biasy game. Anyway, Patrick Roy was this great goalie, 51st overall in 1954. 54. What am I thinking? 1984 to the Habs. He burst on the scene in 1986 as a rookie. Didn't win Rookie of the Year. That was Gary Sutter's job. But anyway, Patrick Roy led the Habs to the 1986 Stanley Cup. Everyone thought they were nuts for getting that cup. And then in 93, coming out of nowhere to help Montreal win another cup. And then in 95, when Mario Tremblay became the head coach, replacing Jacques Demers, him and Roy would clash. December 2nd, 1995 was the accumulation of this clash as Roy gave up 9 goals to the Red Wings. The 62-win Red Wings at that. I scored 11-1. So Roy basically didn't want to play in Montreal ever again because Mario Tremblay didn't pull him up fast enough. And all that. So they were forced in the corner. And since the Avalanche were actually in the Western Conference, they were once the Quebec Nordiques. Patrick wanted to be traded to a Western team because obviously, you don't want Montreal facing an Eastern team that could fuck them over. So they sent Watt and Mike Keane, their captain, what was it, like the 4th captain in 2 years, signed to traded. Colorado gave up Andre Kovalenko, Martin Rushinsky, and Jocelyn Thibault. Thibault had a tough time being Watt's heir apparent. Kovalenko didn't do much for the Habs, and Rushinsky did okay, but other teams he would do well, such as Kovalenko as well. The joke was on Montreal's Watt would win 2 cups with Colorado, especially 96 when they shocked Detroit in the conference finals and won the Stanley Cup finals. It was like, what the hell? But yeah, he did that in 2001. Montreal got nothing. Thibault was nothing. He was hounded too much. Montreal just got their asses bit, and Mario Tremblay as well. Well, that's good. Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Number 5 is Mark Messier being traded from the Oilers to the Red Wings, 1991. So in 1991, the Edmonton Oilers had troubles. Mark Messier didn't like his contract extension, and even though he won the Stanley Cup 5 times as an Oiler, he felt like he needed to leave. So he did. Messier asked for a trade, and then just before the start of the 1991-92 season, they found a trading partner, the New York Rangers, who were willing to part with Brody Nichols, Stephen Rice, Kitchener, and Louis DeBrusque. Brody Nichols was okay for Edmonton, but then was traded to Chicago, creating more magic for them. Stephen Rice was nothing for the others, and Louis DeBrusque was a heavyweight fan favorite. But yeah, Edmonton traded Messier away. Messier became the leader for the Rangers, helped them win the 92 President's Trophy for best regular season. Mark won the Hart Trophy for MVP, and he led the Rangers to the Cup in 94, which he guaranteed Game 6 of the conference finals. So yeah, Messier to the Rangers was huge. Edmonton got not much in return. Messier, after 94, would actually spend a few more years in New York. Then in 97, head to Vancouver, pissing off Canuck fans by asking for number 11, which was Wayne Mackey's number, who died of brain cancer in 1974. But yeah, Messier came back to the Rangers. They actually buried a toy hatchet. Number 4 is Doug Gilmour to the Toronto Maple Leafs in 92. This was a 10-player deal of the ages. Doug Gilmour didn't like his contract, so he sat out. Calgary didn't know who to trade with. Fortunately, Cliff Fletcher, who left the Calgary organization, who just recently passed away, actually knew about the Calgary system. So he managed to talk to Doug Risebrough, Kitchener, former Kitchener Ranger, who became the GM of Calgary, and they entered a 10-player deal. It was actually supposed to be Doug Gilmour for Gary Leeman. Gilmour would head to Toronto. Gary Leeman, former 50-goal scorer, Leafs would head to Calgary. But then big pieces fell. The Leafs would trade Michel Petit, Alex Goduniak, Craig Berube, and Jeff Reese to Calgary to get Gilmore, Jamie McCowan, Rick Natras, Rick Wamsley, and Kent Vanderbilt. I did it without having to cheat. So yeah, that was a massive 10-player deal. Fletcher fleeced the Flames. The Leafs didn't make the playoffs in 92, but fortunately, though, Gilmore in 92-93 was an icon. Almost won MVP. He lost to Gretzky, but yeah, Gilmore was iconic. His impact on Toronto was immediate, enduring, and finally, the Leafs were back in prominence and all that after years of the Valor era. Number 3 is Phil Esposito to the Boston Bruins 1967. People forget that Phil Esposito wasn't always a Boston Bruin or a New York Ranger. He was actually a Chicago Blackhawk. You say, what? Yeah, that's true. The Chicago Blackhawks took Phil Esposito, signed him to contract. Phil and Tony never played on the same team. Tony Esposito would actually had to U.S. college before going to Montreal. Anyway, Phil Esposito was seen as a playoff choker and basically lazy, so the Blackhawks decided to trade him to Boston alongside Ken Hodge Sr. Ken Hodge Jr. did have that 30-goal season. 1991, and alongside Fred Stanfield to Boston for Pete Martin, Gilles Moreau, and Jack Norris. Pete Martin actually was serviceable for Chicago. The other two, not so much. Espo was a superstar. Boston paired him up with Bobby Orr, and those two almost always were top 5 in point scoring for many years. Blackhawks did get to the 1971 Stanley Cup Finals, but they didn't win the Stanley Cup. Boston and Phil Esposito did in 70 and 72. So it was actually worked out. Ken Hodge Sr. worked out well for Boston as well. Fred Stanfield was the lesser of 3 evils. But yeah, Phil Esposito, that was a massive trade to Boston. And then he would be traded to the Rangers in 1975 for Brad Park. Number 2 is the Eric Lindros deal. Very lopsided. Well, Lindros was the number 1 overall pick in 91 from the Nordiques. But he refused to play for the Nordiques. He didn't like the organization. People thought he was being francophobic, as in he hated francophones. And he also had the ultimate hockey helicopter parents, Bonnie and Carl, who basically would berate their coaches, Eric's coaches, and all that. Lindros went back to the Oshawa Generals. He actually was unsigned for 92, and people were saying if Lindros doesn't get signed by 93, he could go back to the draft. So anyway, Quebec had to panic. They decided to try to trade him. There were 2 trades within a 90-minute period, to Philly and to the Rangers. Arbitrator Larry Bertuzzi basically said that the Flyers were first to the mark. The Rangers deal actually was going to be big because it could have ruined the 94 team. Alex Kovalev almost left for Quebec. John Van Beesbrook, Tony Amonte, and a few other players would have left too. But yeah, the Flyers traded away Peter Forsberg, Ron Hextall, Steve Duchesne, Kerry Huffman, and Mike Ricci. You know, the guy with the very long hair? That was a big move. Lindros did okay for Philly if he wasn't concussed. He did get the Flyers to the 97 Stanley Cup Finals, but lost to the Red Wings. In the meantime, Forsberg was that great second center that Quebec needed, and then the Joe Sakic. Ron Hextall played 1 year with the Nordiques and left to go to the others and the Flyers. Steve Duchesne was okay and all that. Mike Ricci stayed in Colorado for a long time. So it all worked out for the Nordiques, not the Flyers. And number 1 is the Wayne Gretzky trade. Come on, you really think I wasn't going to make Wayne Gretzky number 1? Well, you're off. You're a rocker. Anyway, the Oilers and Kings were making a trade. Edmonton had money problems. Peter Pocklington, the owner, had money problems. And only LA and Bruce McDonald listened to a deal. It had to include 15 million smackers to Edmonton, which Bruce McDonald did. Of course, years later, he'd be convicted of fraudulent documents for his coin trading business. But yeah, this was huge. Gretzky, alongside Marty McSorley, were traded to the Oilers. I mean, to the Kings. And Mike Krzyzewski, too, right? Yeah, I think that's right. Kushaleski was also traded to the Kings in that deal. The Kings gave back Jimmy Carson, who was his teenage superstar who became more of a malcontent in Edmonton. Got sent to Detroit in the Adam Graves trade, along with Peter Klima and Joe Murphy. Um, yeah, 2 first-round picks. Martin Jelena, who was still a fresh-faced rookie, who would change overtime goal scoring 10+ years later. And, of course, the $15 million in 3 first-round draft picks. It actually transformed hockey in the Southern United States. We can thank that deal, in a sense, for making sure that the Southern states had hockey. And, of course, Gary fucking Bettman, too. But, yeah, this ruined it. Canada even wanted the trade nullified because you were trading your national export. But TLTL. Gretzky could have easily kiboshed the deal, but he refused, saying he was in too deep. And it didn't help that his wife was a Hollywood actress by the name of Janet Jones. So basically, Gretzky and Jones were vilified in Edmonton. Pogleton was hung in effigy in Edmonton. Edmonton didn't take well, and some United States teams were the norm in the NHL. Black. But it is what it is. And Gretzky knew he had to be part of a good trade. Anyway, I'm Jeff Diamond.